I still remember the scent of Easter lilies clinging to her clothes from that sprawling family party in Charleston. I wasn't with my sister Serenity when her world shattered that afternoon. She was 16, and her car was found mangled and broken on the asphalt of I-26. I only heard the doctor's voice as a tinny urgent echo from a speakerphone. He said she needed surgery within the hour, a single hour, or she was gone. He used the words, "won't make it." And I was sitting right next to my mom, wrapped in a fluffy white robe at a hushed upscale spa. When the hospital put the doctor on speaker, the sound seemed to curdle the cucumber-infused air. I watched my mother, her face a mask of green clay, listen, and then reply with words that froze my blood. "If she doesn't pull through," she sighed, "just inform me later." Her voice was calm, annoyed. "We are in the middle of a treatment, and I'm not signing anything right now." A dismissive wave of her hand. My sister is Serenity Carver. She is 21 now, a testament to someone else's mercy. For 18 days, I crept into her hospital room watching the machines breathe for her. The day she finally fluttered her eyes open, I saw it, the change on the chart at the foot of her bed. A quiet little coup had taken place while she was lost to the world. Our mother's name was no longer listed as her legal guardian. It had been erased. A different name was there instead, written in firm, decisive handwriting. And as for who that new guardian was, well, that's where the real story begins. If you have ever watched the person meant to be your safe harbor deliberately turn their ship and sail away in the middle of your storm, the very second you cried out for help, please just drop the words, "I've seen it," into the comments so my sister knows that she is not the only one who has felt that particular chill. Hit that subscribe button if you want to understand exactly who seized control when the one who gave her life decided it was an inconvenience, because from that moment on, the story only spirals into something far more complex. Let me pull you back to where the cracks first started to show. It all began in that big white house on James Island, a place built on beautiful lies. I remember that island just outside Charleston. It's where my grandchild's world first fractured. Her father was taken by leukemia when she was only 6 years old. One moment I saw him steadying her on a bicycle, his laughter echoing in the humid air, and the next there was only a profound silence where he used to be. After we laid him to rest, I looked at my daughter, lost in her own storm, and knew someone had to be the anchor. So I started showing up every single weekend without fail. I was her mother's father, Clarence Brooks, and I was all she had left of the before times. Back then, everyone in the county still saw me as the police chief, the one who never quite learned how to hang up his hat for good. I suppose they were right. I just swapped the weight of a badge for the comfort of a fishing rod and the slow rhythm of a porch swing. I'd make that drive, my old Ford rattling down the lane, always with a warm container of shrimp and grits from that little joint I liked, over on Shem Creek. I'd watch her climb into the passenger seat, her small face turned to me, and I'd fill the quiet with old stories of chasing shadows down forgotten country roads. In those moments, I wasn't the former chief, I wasn't even Grandpa Clarence. I was just Grandpa. The one promise that was always kept. My daughter Harmony, she swam in her sorrow for what felt like a lifetime, but was really just about a year. And then she met Colin Reed. It happened at some high society function, the kind with champagne and empty smiles. I learned Colin was a big-shot developer buying up Kiowa Island piece by piece. He drove a sterile black Range Rover, the kind of vehicle that always smells like money and nothing else. It only took 2 years for him to put his ring on her finger. They had one of those windswept beachfront weddings. I was there, but my mind was elsewhere. Then, a clinical 9 months passed almost to the day, and Haven was born, a flash of blonde hair and demanding cries. A new gravitational center pulling everything in the family toward her. All at once the house began to forget its past, a nursery appearing overnight. I saw her world shrink after the wedding, invaded by a nanny and a fortress of new rules. Her bedroom, the one she'd had her whole life, was emptied out and moved to the forgotten corner. Right over the garage, a sacrifice made so Haven could have the grander room, the one with the balcony. I remember her soccer, trophies, how they just vanished one day, packed into cardboard tombs. Her own mother started introducing her in this detached way, just as my older daughter, erasing her name as if it were a detail from a past she wanted to forget. She was becoming a ghost in her own home, an out-of-focus figure in their perfect family portrait. By the time she was 14, she had perfected the art of being unseen. Colin provided for her, yes, but it was like funding a project, not raising a child. His eyes would slide right over her unless she was physically in his way. It was a stark contrast to Haven, who was showered with new clothes every season. My cousin, meanwhile, was given the hand-me-down uniforms from a prestigious private school she would never be allowed to attend. The only sanctuary she had, the one place her name was still spoken with love, was at her grandpa's little brick house over in West Ashley, a 20-minute drive across the vast expanse of the Ravenel Bridge. I knew he kept her old bike in his garage, a silent promise of her place there. He made sure the freezer was always stocked with her favorite popsicles, and he possessed the quiet wisdom to never ask why she spent every possible weekend under his roof. That Easter, though, weekend when she was 16 felt different, charged with a strange energy. It was the day of Grandpa's annual cookout, a tradition we all cherished. I can still picture it, 3 long tables sprawling under the shade of the ancient live oaks, the steam rising from a huge pot of low-country boil, the platters of deviled eggs and the sweet tea clinking in heavy mason jars. Cousins we hadn't seen in years had even flown in for it. There was this beautiful chaos of music, kids screaming with joy, and the familiar comforting smell of charcoal drifting on the breeze. And I saw her standing there in the pale, yellow sundress I knew her grandpa had bought her just the week before. A month prior, a piece of silver he claimed mirrored the reflection in her eyes. Pressed against her skin, I felt her exhale a ghost of a feeling that she was home, that perhaps I was an anchor to a time when she wasn't. Adrift. Then the illusion shattered. I felt her freeze, her heartbeat a trapped bird, as her mother's voice drifted from the dessert table, sweet and oblivious. A careless laugh spilled from her lips, painting a picture for someone on the phone. A picture of her and Haven, a mother-daughter spa day already sealed with a promise. I felt the words like tiny pinpricks against her skin, facials, massages. The entire perfect package. And beyond that, a new horizon opened up, one that soared over turquoise water to the Bahamas for the spring holiday. But it was a horizon built for 3, for her, for Colin, and for Haven. Her own name was a brief dismissive mention. I grew cold against her chest. She was holding a dish of banana pudding, a childhood comfort, and I could feel the warmth leaving her, until both were just cold weights. I felt the tremor in her voice as she told her grandpa about a sudden headache, a fabricated pain to escape a real one. He resisted his concern, a warm pressure she pulled away from. I could sense his knowing gaze on her, seeing the invisible wound, but she just needed the void. His keys, cool and solid, were pressed into her palm, the keys to the 1998 Jeep Wrangler, a machine he'd helped her claim, piece by piece with the sun-soaked wages of a lifeguard's summer. His voice was a low murmur against the party's noise. "Drive careful, baby girl. Text me when you get there." A small, tight nod was her only reply, a promise swallowed by the night. The last light was dying as she merged onto the I-26, pointing the Jeep's nose to the west. A spring storm gathered itself with breathtaking speed, the way they always do in that low-country sky, a bruise of purple and green. The world dissolved into a churning emerald haze as the rain came in solid curtains. The windshield wipers slashed back and forth, a frantic, desperate pulse against the glass, but the storm was winning. The river of headlights around her slowed to a sluggish crawl. I felt the bass of the radio thrumming through her sternum, a wall of sound to keep the silence at bay. It was an old country lament, a story of loss sung by a lonely guitar. I watched her drive the old Jeep, the one I used to love. Through the rain-streaked glass, the world outside dissolved into abstract light. Long smears of white and crimson painted the darkness. I felt the danger before she could see it. A shadow, a behemoth of steel and thunder, materialized from the storm far too close. Time stretched and warped. The colossal machine lost its battle with the slick asphalt folding in on itself. It slid like a predator across 3 lanes of highway, its target tragically, inevitably her. The impact on her door, the driver's side, was a cataclysm, a force of at least 60 miles an hour. A symphony of destruction, the shriek of tortured metal, the crystalline explosion of glass. Her world inverted once, then twice the sky, and ground swapping places as the roof buckled under the strain. It finally ground to a halt, a mangled wreck resting upside down against the cold concrete median. I hovered there in the sudden deafening quiet, seeing what she could not. The nylon strap, her only anchor, bit deep into her shoulder, a cruel savior. I saw the crimson on her lips, the life essence I couldn't taste, followed by a silence that was louder than the crash itself. And then for a moment her consciousness slipped away from me into a void. From the distance a wail began, a chorus of sirens piercing the night. They screamed towards her, a promise of help. The emergency room at MUSC was a maelstrom of controlled panic. I watched them swarm around her, their voices sharp and urgent, barking codes I didn't understand. The machines shrieked her body's protests, a constant high-pitched alarm. A voice kept demanding more, negative. That universal blood type, a desperate plea for life itself. They rushed her gurney into the sterile glare of Trauma Bay 1. Shears sliced through her clothes, remnants of a normal day now discarded in seconds. I watched as needles pierced the soft skin of both her arms as tubes were forced down her throat to breathe for her. A surgeon, his scrubs already marked with the crimson of other battles, loomed over the gurney. His voice was a low, urgent hum reciting the litany of her injuries to his team. Her pelvis a fractured ruin, her spleen torn open, a slow, insidious bleed clouding her mind. They had less, he said, than a single hour before the damage became permanent before she slipped away for good. They were fighting time and they needed permission. My daughter's permission. To wheel her into surgery to give her a fighting chance, and they needed it now. A nurse, her eyes filled with a weary compassion, picked up the small shattered phone. Her thumb scrolled to the contact labeled Mom and initiated the call that would change everything. The call connected on the third agonizing ring, a sound that sliced through the rhythmic beeping that was my only companion. From the phone's tiny speaker, a world away, leaked the sound of trickling water and the electric hum of a place designed for escape. Then, my mother's face swam into view, a ghastly white mask of clay clinging to her skin. It was a perfect, serene facade, punctuated only by the two dark green circles of cucumber that hid her eyes from me. I could see Haven, a blurry shape on the table beside her, cocooned in her own world. A white cord snaked from her ear, her thumb a blur as she flickered through other people's lives on a glowing screen. "Mrs. Reed," a gentle but firm voice began, "this is Nurse Alvarez at MUSC Trauma." The nurse, a woman with weary kindness in her eyes, tilted the phone's camera. And through that small digital window, she forced my mother to see me. To see the wreckage of her daughter, a face painted in drying crimson, a plastic tube violating my throat. "Your daughter," the nurse continued, her voice steady, "has been in a severe accident." The words felt distant, like a story about someone else. "She has life-threatening injuries." I watched them land on my mother's masked face, causing not a single ripple. "She requires immediate surgery. We need your verbal consent right now." The nurse's plea hung in the air, heavy with unspoken finality. She may not survive the next hour without it. Slowly, deliberately, Harmony's fingers rose and peeled one of the cucumber slices away. She squinted at the screen, not with horror, but with the mild annoyance of someone trying to read small print. Haven, sensing the shift, pulled a single earbud out, her expression one of bored curiosity as she leaned into the frame. A man's deeper voice cut in the doctor, his face etched with an urgency they didn't share. "Ma'am," he pressed, "we're looking at multiple fractures, severe internal bleeding, and possible brain swelling." He was cataloging my broken pieces, trying to make her understand the gravity. "We have to open her up, immediately." And then Harmony sighed. It was a long, drawn-out exhalation. The sound you make when the waiter brings you the wrong drink, a minor, frustrating inconvenience. "If she doesn't make it," she stated, her voice as flat and lifeless as the wall behind her, "just call me when it's over." The words were a quiet execution delivered without a hint of emotion. "We're in the middle of a treatment here," she added, as if that explained everything. "And I'm not driving all the way downtown just to sign some papers." In the silence that followed her decree, a sound erupted from Haven. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh, quickly muffled by a hand that couldn't quite hide her smirk. And then, through the phone's screen, I saw her take a picture of this poor child's broken face, on my gurney. I watched her perfectly manicured thumbs move with an unnerving speed, tapping away. It wasn't until later that the full cold horror of her words would reach us, the caption she was sending to what I can only assume was a group of friends. "Finally some peace." My own hand, the one holding the phone, began to shake, a tremor of pure rage. Dr. Miller, standing just over my shoulder, let out a choked whisper, "Jesus Christ." I heard a tech behind me say, "Please tell me you're recording this." I forced my voice to remain steady, my training kicking in. "Ma'am, we have a legal obligation here for a minor." But she cut me off, that woman Harmony. "Call my father, Clarence Brooks," she said, her tone utterly detached. "He'll sort it out. We paid for the full day's pass after all." Then the line went dead. The silence she left behind was heavier than any sound. We all just stared at the blank black mirror of the phone. One of the residents clenched his fist so tight his knuckles were white, looking like he wanted to shatter the device. I took a breath and swiped down the screen past her name to the next. Emergency contact Grandpa. His old beat-up Ford was already tearing down the highway by the time the call connected. We'd caught him mid-task, a world away from this sterile chaos. He'd been sitting peacefully on his porch, meticulously deveining shrimp for the following night's dinner. The instant the words "serenity" and "critical" left my mouth, he told us later, the bowl just slipped from his hands. He didn't even stop to think, just gunned the engine across the Ashley River Bridge. A man propelled by sheer love, still wearing his tall rubber boots and an apron caked with the day's work, stained with salt water and fish blood. A sudden squall hit the city, rain hammering our windows. The sky lit up with flashes of lightning. He turned a 25-minute drive into 16. He didn't just walk through the ER doors. He exploded through them, dripping rain and desperation. I saw the glint of metal, first the badge from 30 years ago. A familiar weight he still carried on his belt, more talisman than habit. A woman in scrubs her face, a mask of authority, took one look at the retired chief, and a silent understanding passed between them. She simply nodded him through. I watched him sign the papers they pushed in front of him, a flurry of consent forms. His eyes not seeing the words, only the barrier they represented between him and me. His hand, a hand that had always been so steady, trembled so violently. The pen dug into the paper with a desperate scratching sound. Then they let him in. He stood in the bay just long enough to see the web of tubes they'd woven around me, to see a face he barely recognized as mine, swollen and pale. He leaned over, his warm breath a ghost against my ear, and I heard him whisper the old words, the ones that used to be my shield, against the shadows that danced in my room when I was a little girl. "I've got you, baby girl. Grandpa's right here." And then they were wheeling me away towards the cold, bright light of surgery. I watched him pull a single metal chair across the sterile floor, its legs screaming in protest until it rested against the glass wall of the operating room. He sat down, a lone sentinel beginning his watch. He would not move for the next 9 hours. Not when a kind nurse offered coffee that would go cold, not when the low murmur of the waiting room faded into an echoing silence. Not even when the world outside raged and a sudden storm plunged the corridor into darkness for 12 breathless minutes. His silhouette the only constant until the backup generators hummed back to life. And when they finally wheeled me towards the ICU in the gray moments just before dawn, he rose like a shadow and fell into step beside my bed, his large hand finding mine, ignoring the coldness that had crept in hours before. The next 18 days, I could feel it, stretched out before him like a barren, endless road. The air in the ICU was thick, a sterile mix of chemicals and unspoken dread, and the machines they kept their own terrible rhythm, hissing and beeping a song that wasn't life. A place that made you feel how fragile that dividing line truly was. He staked his claim on the vinyl recliner by the bed, a silent declaration that he was immovable. We tried to gently suggest he go home just for that first night, but he simply reached into a worn leather wallet, showing us the old badge nestled inside his voice, quiet but firm. "I'm not going anywhere." And after that, the discussion was over. His sleep was a restless thing, coming in fractured 30-minute intervals. His head leaned back against the plastic mouth, slightly agape, work boots, stubbornly laced. And in the moments he was awake, he would talk, a constant low murmur meant to cut through the rhythmic beeping of the machines. I'd hear fragments as I checked the IV drip, stories about the night of the birth and how he was the first to hold that tiny body, a privilege granted by a mother's sheer exhaustion. I heard him recount a long-ago summer when the patient was only 8, a tale of a 5-foot shark battled right off the Folly Beach pier, and the child's determined screams until the fishing rod was finally relinquished. Sometimes he would read, his voice shifting with the characters, from a book with a cover as soft and worn as an old blanket, To Kill a Mockingbird. I saw him pull it from an old bag, a piece of the world he'd brought in from his truck, performing every single line with a quiet, desperate energy. On other nights, when words failed, a soft humming would fill the room, an old hymn he said his own mother used to sing to him, a melody from a different century, a lullaby weaving through the sterile air. The specialists would drift in and out their white coats like passing ghosts. I was there the morning the neurologist delivered the good news, his words clinical and precise. The swelling in the brain was receding. I was also there that afternoon when the orthopedic surgeon spoke, warning that the shattered pelvis might never mend perfectly. Through it all, the old man just listened, his face a mask, and simply nodded. His voice on the phone was a razor asking questions sharp enough to draw blood, I could tell. I'd see the nurses flinch, but then he'd turn from the phone and his whole demeanor would soften as he took that limp hand in his, as if the two men were separate people. On the 16th day, a shift in the sterile air. The machines, our stoic gods, finally offered a sign of grace. The numbers on the monitor began to trend toward life. I watched his blood pressure settle into a steady, reassuring rhythm. We eased back on the cot ventilator, letting the lungs remember their own strength. I saw the old man Grandpa break into a weary, waterlogged smile, the first real light on his face in 2 weeks. It was later that afternoon he was leaning low over the bed, a quiet promise of red fish running in the bay, a world outside these white walls. He was whispering that they'd be on the water the moment those eyes opened. That's when a shadow fell. Across the doorway, a tall, severe figure silhouetted in a perfectly tailored navy suit. The name on the visitor pass read Donovan, a name I'd heard Grandpa mutter in his sleep. I heard a whisper later that they'd carried badges together some 25 years ago. Now, their only shared field was a poker table, once a month. Grandpa's gaze lifted, locking onto the thin file in Donovan's hand, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. An entire history, an entire order passed in that one silent gesture. Donovan was gone, and I watched from the window as he slid into a silver Lexus, a shark cutting through the Placid Hospital parking lot, heading straight for James Island, a place he didn't need directions to. He would find them just as Grandpa knew he would, Harmony and Haven, standing in a pristine foyer framed by the kind of luggage that costs more than my car, a monument to their impending carefree escape. I could see it in my mind's eye, two matching bubblegum pink suitcases poised for flight, already bearing crisp white tags for a 7-night Royal Caribbean cruise. A floating palace scheduled to drift out of Charleston Harbor with the morning tide. Colin, the husband, would be upstairs, his voice a disembodied murmur on some important work call. Haven, the daughter, lost in the glow of her phone, perfecting a carefree twirl for her followers. And Harmony, the wife, orchestrating it all, completely oblivious to the ghost from the past now walking up her driveway. I watched him from his passenger seat, his gaze locked on the manicured lawn, a stark contrast to the grim purpose of our visit. The doorbell chimed, a cheerful, hollow sound. Donovan offered his name in a low, steady murmur as he extended the envelope. It felt heavy just looking at it, weighted with consequences. He simply stood there, a pillar of calm, and waited. I watched her perfectly manicured nails tear at the seal with a frantic energy, a sound like ripping fabric. Inside, 2 documents lay exposed, their cold black letterhead a stark pronouncement of judgment. The first was the one I'd read a dozen times, an emergency petition to sever the most fundamental of bonds, all on the grounds of profound medical neglect. The second was a civil claim equally devastating. It came from the hospital, a bill not just in dollars but in a life nearly lost. A tally of every extraordinary measure taken, followed by a line item for something immeasurable: pain and suffering. Both documents bore the name Harmony Reed, a brand of accountability. But she wasn't alone. At 14 years old, Haven had been deemed old enough to have knowingly participated in the refusal, and so her name was printed there as well. I saw the blood drain from beneath Harmony's spray tan, leaving the bronze veneer looking like a brittle orange mask. In the reflection of the storm door, I saw Haven freeze her phone, which had been recording her dance, a faltering mid-spin. Donovan's voice then cut through the sudden, thick silence. "You have 72 hours to respond." He finished his tone a flat line, leaving no room for argument or negotiation. "After that," he added, his gaze unwavering, "a judge has already been briefed for an emergency hearing." And that's when the dam of Harmony's composure finally shattered. A torrent of words erupted, lawyers' conspiracies, a righteous fury that rang completely hollow to my ears. She shrieked about mistakes, about how dare anyone have the audacity to question her parenting. It must have been a cue, because Haven crumpled into a fit of theatrical sobs, a performance of practiced regret. She wailed about how the texts, the damning evidence, were just a joke she didn't mean. Through it all, Donovan didn't flinch. He simply turned his job complete, his shoulders set. I fell into step behind him, walking back to the car as the chaos of that house began to boil over at our backs. The front door was still ajar, and through the gap I saw Harmony's perfect posture crumble as she slid down the wall. She was clutching those papers to her chest like a death shroud, her expensive mascara, carving dark inky rivers down her sculpted cheeks. All the while, Haven's voice pierced the air. She wasn't screaming about her mother, but about how this whole disaster was going to ruin her spring break. Then a man, Colin, I presumed, appeared at the top of the stairs, a shadow drawn by the noise. He took one look at the documents clutched in his wife's hands, and a dawning horror erased his face completely. He returned, looking ashen, a phantom wearing the skin of a man I recognized. Not a single word was spoken of the visitor, as if the meeting had been erased from time. He simply resumed his post, his large hand enveloping hers, humming that hymn into the sterile air, a constant low vibration of faith against the electronic pulse of the machines. Then, after 2 days that felt like an eternity, her eyelids fluttered. A flicker of pain crossed her features, the first sign of her return to the world of sensation. I saw her mouth tighten, tasting the bitter residue of tubes and unconsciousness. The monitors, our tireless narrators, shifted their frantic beeping to a calmer, more hopeful rhythm. Her gaze, cloudy and unfocused, drifted until it locked onto the one constant in the room. His face, a roadmap of worry etched with stubble. His eyes, raw and red-rimmed, suddenly broke into a grin so wide it seemed to physically hurt him, a beautiful, painful sight. "Hey, baby girl." The words were a fragile rasp, barely more than breath. "Welcome back." I watched her try to respond, her throat working silently. Nothing but a dry, hollow sound escaped the ghost of a voice long unused. His hand, steady despite the tremor I saw in his arm, immediately pressed the call button. Then he reached for the small whiteboard that had been his silent companion at the foot of her bed. He held it before her eyes, a declaration he had been waiting to make. Even from the doorway I could read the heavy black marker, the letters thick with purpose. Legal Guardian Clarence Brooks. It was more than a statement. It was a shield. She stared at those 3 words, her eyes wide, until the focus broke and they blurred into ink. Tears, slow and silent, escaped and traced a path backward into her hair. He wiped them with a thumb, the skin rough and calloused from a life of hard work, a gesture of such profound, gentle care it seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. Over the next few hours, in the quiet moments between my checks and the doctor's exams, between the pen lights shined in her pupils and the adjustments to her IV drip, he began to unspool the truth for her, his voice a low, steady murmur. I saw him angle his phone to show her the screen, the cold blue light of a video call. I heard the name Haven, and saw the grim set of his jaw as he explained the screenshot. The official papers, which I'd seen him clutching for days, were finally explained. A war won while she was lost in sleep. He offered her the truth without polish, a bitter medicine he knew was necessary for her to heal. I saw the truth land in her eyes, a final, brutal realization he'd never been the father she deserved. The tears that came then were different, not from the pain in her body, but from a wound far deeper. It was a strange kind of relief, a release so absolute it looked like it might pull her under just to set her free. 3 long weeks passed in that sterile white room before I could finally bring her home. Not to that house on James Island, never again. I was taking her to the only sanctuary I had, to my little gray house perched on stilts, a fortress against the tide and the past. Out on Folly Beach, just 15 minutes south of the city, but it felt like a lifetime away from all that. I watched her as I carried her inside, saw her chest rise and fall with the first clean breath of salt air. She felt impossibly light in my arms, a fragile thing the world had tried to break. The room I'd fixed for her had been my old fishing tackle room for 30 years. I'd cleared it all out and painted the walls the pale blue of the morning sky. I even found those old wind chimes, the ones we'd made from shells and driftwood on the beach. She was only 9 then. I hung them, so the first thing she'd see from her window was the memory of a better time. And beyond them, the ocean rolling in and out, a promise that everything keeps moving. That next Monday, the real grinding work began. I watched her fight to just sit up, a monumental effort that left her shaking. Then came standing, and then the slow, painful shuffle behind the cold metal of a walker. I hovered behind her, my hands outstretched, a silent promise that I wouldn't let her fall. It felt just like it did when she was 2 years old, taking her first clumsy steps toward me. I cooked shrimp and grits for dinner every single night, mashing them up until they were soft. It was the only way to get food past the wires that held her jaw in place, a grim, metallic reminder. We'd sit on the porch swing and watch the sun melt into the horizon, my arm around her bony shoulders. Some hurts are too big for words, and we both understood that. The quiet between us was a space for healing, not for filling with noise. One afternoon, a harsh buzzing sound cut through the peace from the kitchen counter. Her phone. The screen glowed with a name I wish she never had to see again. Her mother. She just stood there staring at it as it rang once, twice, all the way to 10 times. I watched her from the doorway of the kitchen, my heart in my throat, but I kept my silence. I saw her finger reach out, decisive and steady, and press the red button to end the call. Then she turned the phone over face down and walked back to the quiet of the porch. I saw her just that once, a ghost on my front steps, and she never dared again. Meanwhile, Colin's lawyers were already drawing up the papers that same week. His firm had apparently secured some lucrative deal with the Port Authority, and I suppose a shattered child wasn't good for the corporate image. He couldn't have that, tainting his precious name. He was gone from that James Island house so fast you'd think it was on fire, grabbing nothing but his suits and those damned golf clubs. As for Haven, she put on quite a show online, a storm of public grief that lasted precisely 3 days until the calls came in and those scholarship offers vanished into thin air. Then suddenly silence. I never spoke of them, not unless Wren brought them up first. My anger was my own to carry. When she'd ask, I kept it simple, kept it true. They made their choice, I told her. Now we have to make ours. There were nights her screams would tear me from my sleep, a sound that clawed at the walls. I'd pull on my old police academy sweats, my uniform for a different kind of watch, and sit on the edge of her, bed my hand covering hers, just holding on until the medicine dragged her back under to a quieter dark. On other nights, it was the silence that woke me. I'd find myself in the living room, the floorboards cold, my voice a rough whisper, bargaining with a God I wasn't sure was listening, just asking for enough time on this earth to see her smile again without it breaking. Time passed. The stitches dissolved, leaving pale thin lines, and the heavy casts were replaced by braces. I watched as she took her first steps down the length of the pier, her jaw set not once, stopping. The next day, I went out and bought 2 fishing rods and a bucket of shrimp. We found our spot at the very end, right where the water gets deep and the world feels quiet again. She'd stand in the surf for hours, her line slack in the water, not really fishing. She didn't care about the catch. I just watched the sun bleach the last of that sterile hospital scent from her skin. I'd see her stare out, her gaze lost on that endless line where the water met the sky, the wind pulling strands of her hair across her face, and I knew then she'd finally stopped waiting. The vigil was over. She wasn't looking for remorse or reasons or any kind of hollow second chance she had no intention of ever giving. The ocean just kept its rhythm, indifferent and eternal, just as it has always had. Then, after a couple of months of that healing salt air, the day of the preliminary hearing finally dawned on us. The courthouse on Broad Street had this oppressive smell, a mix of decaying legal texts and astringent floor wax. She moved through it on crutches, her grandpa a steady rock on one side and me holding her other arm. I saw her mother first sitting at the defendant's table in a navy suit that hung off her frame at least 2 sizes too large. Her face was swollen, stripped bare of any makeup. And Haven, her sister, was a collapsed shape beside her in a pretentious private school blazer, her eyes glued to the floorboards. Pure cowardice. The judge was a woman with a formidable crown of steel, gray hair, and an expression that promised zero patience. She adjusted her spectacles and gave a curt nod to the bailiff, signaling for the recording to begin. The FaceTime call flared to life on the large screen, her shattered body strapped to a gurney. That sickeningly serene spa music tinkling in the background. Then her mother's voice, crystalline and utterly cold. If she doesn't make it, just call me when it's over. I felt her flinch beside me. Then came Haven's laugh, a sharp, ugly sound. Then the screenshot filled the screen, her own blood-streaked face with her sister's, cruel mocking caption scrawled underneath. A heavy silence descended on the courtroom. The courtroom air grew thick, so heavy you could taste the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. I saw a juror's hand fly to her mouth, a small white bird of shock. Donovan placed the phone on the polished wood as if it were a venomous snake he'd just charmed. Then came the paper trail laid out like a death shroud. Haven's name was on every page. She had blasted that heartbreaking image to 7 different circles of friends, all within 4 minutes of receiving it. And then her message appeared on the screen for all to see. The words were stark and digital. 1 less person stealing my spring break. I watched the judge's hand, the way her pen just stopped. It hung there, suspended in a moment of pure disbelief. Her eyes lifted and found harmony. The gaze wasn't just long, it was a slow, deliberate dissection. Mrs. Reed, she said, her voice the sound of a frozen lake cracking in 23 years on this bench. I have never, not once, heard a parent speak of their own flesh and blood with such malice, especially not while that child was in a hospital bed clinging to life. I felt Clarence's shoulder beside me finally relax. Temporary, full custody. The judge declared the words cutting through the tension is immediately transferred to Mr. Clarence Brooks effective as of this moment. We will reconvene for the permanent hearing. And then she brought the gavel down. The crack of wood on wood was a gunshot, and the echo bounced off the marble walls, a sound of finality. It was only 3 days later that the first domino fell. Harmony was let go from her position at the South Carolina State Credit Union. It turned out there are certain rules, certain lines you can't cross when your job involves handling federal funds. A little charge called medical neglect of a minor is, as it happens, an immediate and non-negotiable disqualifier. I heard they walked her out a security guard on each arm carrying nothing but a single cardboard box. And then came Haven's turns. Her full ride, academic scholarship, her golden ticket to the College of Charleston was rescinded that very same week. The admissions board sent a letter. They mentioned something about conduct, incompatible with the core values of the institution. It seems cruelty has a price after all. Institution. Then, just like that, the air around Harmony turned sour. The same private high school that had paraded her around like a prize began to spit her name out in hushed, ugly tones. I saw it from a distance. It took less than a month for the bank's sign to go up on the lawn of that James Island house, a stark, white flag of surrender. Colin, of course, was long gone, his name wiped clean from the paperwork. I heard he'd signed it all away, a neat little trick to keep his own. Pockets lined, predictable. I watched them move what little they had left into a sad little two-bedroom box off the Savannah Highway, the kind of place where hope goes to die with paint flaking like sunburnt skin and an elevator that had given up the ghost. Haven's car vanished too. Harmony started working nights, I heard, stacking cans in the cold fluorescent light of a grocery store just to keep a roof over their heads. But while their world fell apart, ours began to mend. My grandchild started the real work. Twice a week, that white van would pull up a beacon I both dreaded and welcomed. It was for the outpatient rehab at MUSC, a place for rebuilding. I'd hear snippets later about relearning the simple betrayal of stairs, about finding a center of gravity on some strange blue ball, about the slow, terrifying process of trusting their own legs not to fail them. I was there for every trip, every single time. I'd sit in that sterile lobby, its silence broken only by the quiet hum of the lights, and I'd reread the same 3 fishing magazines until the ink blurred. Then they'd come out drenched in sweat, a fine tremor in their hands, but standing tall. Thursdays were different. Thursdays were for the wounds no one could see. A trauma counselor named Dr. Rivera in a small office that I imagined smelled of something calming like lavender. I didn't need to hear what they talked about. I saw it in their eyes, the nightmares, the coiled rage, the awful weight of the day. They realized some sounds, some voices were a poison they couldn't listen to anymore. And I'd just wait in the truck windows rolled down, letting the old country station fill the space between us. Station low, never once complaining about the heat. Some afternoons, when the pain in my hips got too loud, I'd sit on the back deck and throw pieces of bread to the GS. Grandpa would join me with 2 sweet teas and we'd watch the tide go out. He never tried to fix my anger, he just let me feel it. By the end of summer, I could ditch the crutches for a cane, then the cane for nothing at all. I still walked with a slight limp, but the doctor said most of it would fade by my 18th birthday. One evening, I made it all the way to the end of Folly Pier and back without stopping. Grandpa met me halfway carrying a blanket and a flashlight, even though the sun hadn't set yet. We sat on the sand shoes off, letting the waves lick our toes. I leaned my head on his shoulder. "Thank you for staying," I said. He kissed the top of my head. "Nowhere else I'd rather be, baby girl." 7 months after the crash, the final trial day came. I walked into the courtroom without crutches, cane, or limp. The scar on my forehead was still pink, but my head was high. Grandpa sat right behind me in his Sunday suit, the one he wore to my dad's funeral. Harmony. I watched Harmony from across the room. She seemed to have shrunken, a smaller, harder version of a memory, her hair pulled back with a severity that matched her expression, one hand strangling a paper tissue she would never use. Beside her, Haven was a statue staring into nothing, arms locked across her chest so tightly I could see the bloodless white of her knuckles. Then Donovan's voice cut through the silence, calling them to the stand. I watched them rise, swear the oath with a hand that didn't tremble, and sit. Their eyes found the judges and held a silent challenge in the heavy air. Tell the court how it felt. Donovan's voice was gentle, but the words were a blade, knowing your mother chose not to be there while you were on the edge of death. I saw them take a single deep breath, and the entire room seemed to hold its own. It felt they began like the very last part of me that held on to the belief that I had any worth finally gave out on that operating table. Their voice was a low, steady thing, a miracle of control. In that one moment of silence from her, I learned a complete lesson, that I was something that could be thrown away. A pin could have dropped. And the teacher was the same woman who once chased away nightmares by reading stories to me in the dark. They recounted it all the cold facts I knew by heart, waking up in a sterile room to see their grandfather's name listed as their sole guardian. The ghost of a single missed call on a phone screen, a call they would never, ever return. I remembered every one of those nights, putting on the sound of the ocean for them, a tide to wash away the silence, a better noise than the question that haunted the room. Why wasn't I enough? Then Harmony's lawyer stood weaving a tapestry of excuses, trying to recast her as a fragile thing stressed, overwhelmed victim. He spoke of a lost job, a foreclosed home, a failed marriage, grievances that sounded like paper tearing in a hurricane. Through it all, they never once let their gaze drift towards her. Not a single glance. When the lawyer's empty words finally ceased, the judge turned to them. "Is there anything further you wish to add?" "Yes, Your Honor." The answer was immediate, clear as a bell. I could see it etched on her face. This was never about the money, not a single dime. Nor was it about hearing hollow apologies. All she craved was the quiet after the storm. She glanced at me, and in that look I saw our truth. We were already a family. Then we turned back to the judge. The wait was mercifully short. The judge returned in what felt like no more than 20 minutes. She walked in her face unreadable, and the silence in the room became absolute. "Permanent termination," she began. It all came down to that one cold legal phrase, the parental rights to Harmony Reed. The words were swift, decisive. Effective immediately, a civil judgment is awarded in favor of the plaintiff and the hospital. Justice cold and final was being served. The figure named was $480,000, a number that felt both immense and meaningless. "The James Island property," the judge continued, "will be sold at auction to satisfy the lien." That house, a monument to their greed, was being turned to dust. Then came the words that made my old heart pound in my chest. "Mr. Clarence Brooks is granted full legal adoption. This case is closed." For a fleeting moment, the judge's eyes met mine across the room. The gavel fell with a solid, definitive thud, the sound of a new beginning. Outside the courtroom doors, a wall of reporters surged forward, a cacophony of flashing lights. Their shouted questions were just noise. I ignored every one of them, pulling Serenity close. She tucked her arm through mine, and together we moved forward, a united front. We stepped out of the courthouse shadows and into the brilliant, welcoming October sunshine. 3 weeks later, word reached me. The bank had put chains and a padlock on the door of that big white house. A small moving truck appeared one afternoon there to collect the few possessions that Harmony and her boy Haven had decided were worth keeping from the wreckage. I watched from a distance as they loaded a few worn-out boxes into an old, tired sedan. They turned onto Interstate 26, heading north, searching for a place cheap enough to disappear. Somewhere no one would ever know their names. A ghost fading into the horizon. Serenity never asked where they went. That same month, a thick envelope arrived for us. The official adoption papers. I set them on the table, my hands trembling just a little. I watched her pick up the pen and for the first time sign the name Serenity Brooks. The tears that followed were a storm of release more powerful than any I'd seen even on the day she woke from that long darkness. As I watched her, I knew I had to frame that document. I hung that certificate right above our fireplace, a declaration of the family we had always been, now and forever. I watched her place it right there next to my son's old service photo. That was the year she started over her senior year at that little alternative school, just a 10-minute drive from Folly Beach. I saw the difference it made the small classes, the teachers who looked at her and saw a student, not a story. No one there knew our past, not unless she was the one to tell them, and she blossomed. Made the honor roll every single quarter. Then the acceptance letter came, and early decision for the College of Charleston. Her future was right here, close enough that she could still come home for dinner every night if she wanted to. I remember her graduation day, dawning on us warm with a breeze off the water. I saw her in that pale blue cap and gown, and I swear it was the exact same shade as the bedroom walls I'd painted for her all those years ago. A fresh start. And when the announcer called her name, the sound of it filled the air and the entire senior class rose to their feet, a wave of cheers just for her. By then, they all knew. They knew the road she'd walked, and they knew who had been walking it with her. I was waiting right there at, the bottom of those steps, standing tall in my dress uniform. I'd polished every medal that morning until I could see my own proud, blurry reflection. She didn't walk, she ran. Came right to me and threw her arms around my neck. And I did what I'd always done. I lifted her clean off the ground, just for a second, feeling like she was still that little girl. 5 years. It's been 5 years since that terrible Easter Sunday. She's 21 now. That psychology diploma of hers is on the wall, and she's taken her own story, her own trauma, and become a counselor. Works at a nonprofit just across the bridge, in Mount Pleasant. And I know that every single day, she sits across from some kid who feels lost, a teenager who thinks no one on this earth will ever truly choose them. And my girl gets to look them in the eye and tell them they're wrong. Because someone once chose her. I watched him choose her, opening my doors when the ones who were meant to be her harbor walked away into the haze, leaving without a single backward glance. My old man turned 77 last month. I still feel the steady hum of his mower across the lawn, tended by his own hands. I still smell the brine and triumph on the air when he returns his catch, eclipsing that of any charter boat captain drifting past my pilings. My wooden bones still soak in the savory steam of the best shrimp and grits in the entire state. I am that house on stilts, a constant witness. My wind chimes still sing their familiar song to the sea. My porch swing still offers its rhythmic groaning comfort. The coffee pot on my counter, a dark sentinel, is always half full. Her room, once just a space, still holds its coat of pale blue. His tackle room became her sanctuary, and by some unspoken pact, it has remained so. They never sought to turn back time. Most nights they carry their dinner out onto my deck, two quiet figures watching the silver flash of dolphins chasing mullet in the surf. I hear his voice weathered as my shingles call her baby girl. Just once a day, the words hanging in the humid air as he hands her a glass of sweet tea. And her reply, Grandpa, settles into my framework like a load-bearing beam. No other names would feel as true within these walls. The discord of Harmony and Haven faded from South Carolina for good 3 years ago. The last whisper I caught on the wind placed them somewhere in Georgia, their lives contained within a rented trailer, hidden beneath borrowed names. She has never sent a search party for those ghosts, and they have never tried to find their way back to her. The resulting silence is clean washed by the tide. It is absolute. It is a profound peace. I hear the visitors ask sometimes, their voices low, if she is angry, but I see no storm in her. The energy that fuels anger, she instead invests in the simple, profound act of living. Some ask her about forgiveness, but forgiveness is not a key she holds. It is a bridge they burned, and they are the only ones who can rebuild it. I saw the moment the calls stopped being returned. It wasn't about trying anymore. It was an acceptance. And what I felt wasn't pride, but a quiet aching sense of duty that settled in my bones. A feeling that took root in the silence they left behind. A duty to the child I watched over while sleeping in a cold vinyl chair for 18 nights straight. I was just a retired chief, but I knew what a watch was. I knew how to stand it. Every drive to therapy was another patrol, another perimeter check on their well-being. I just opened my doors, and they were the one who brought the light back in, turning this quiet old house into a sanctuary, turning my weary heart into a safe harbor. I've seen enough in my life to know that the word family has little to do with shared blood. It's about the one who shows up, who stands in the gap when everyone else has gone. It's the face you see when the fluorescent lights of a hospital are all you know, when the beeping of machines is the only sound. Family is the one whose hand feels steady on the pen signing forms that should have never been theirs to sign. It's the presence that asks for nothing, that simply is. A weight I was honored to carry. If you're out there and the night feels too long and you think you're alone, I'm telling you, look past the empty spaces. Look to the edges of your life. The quiet ones are there. They are always there. Sometimes it's an old man you'd long since written off sitting in a waiting room. Sometimes it's the person you least expect to answer the call in the middle of the night. A friend, a mentor, a neighbor whose porch light stays on, the one who simply will not be turned away. And when you see that light, you walk toward it. You understand that this kind of bond isn't given. It's forged. It's built deliberately every single morning you wake up. You build it on the hard days. The ones where showing up feels impossible, where the cost is measured in sleep and peace and pieces of your own heart. That is the most profound truth I have ever had the privilege to witness. And that is my side of the story.